Good morning. Today's lecture is about President Ronald Reagan, his successor, George H.W. Bush, and the end of the Cold War. In the 1970s, Americans had begun to doubt their place in the world. The decade of the 1970s was not a prosperous decade. The previous 2.5 decades, from 1945 into the 1970s, had been wonderfully prosperous for Americans. The recovery from the Great Depression and then from the Second World War had brought a standard of living that no other nation in the world experienced at that time. But the 70s seemed to mark a decline. Unemployment and inflation, that is, the inflation of prices, the cost of goods in America, were both far, far too high. And Arab nations were kicking sand in our faces in the form of high oil prices. This was a time when America was dependent upon foreign oil to run our economy. And Arab nations of the Middle East were some of the most important exporters of crude oil. In the late 1970s, President Jimmy Carter and the Democrats seemed to believe that the United States had entered a new era of permanent limits. Limits on prosperity and limits even on freedom. Indeed, many believed the United States was in decline relative to the rest of the world. They foresaw the end of the so-called American century. So in the 1980 presidential election, many Americans enjoyed hearing during the campaign that such was not the case. Jimmy Carter ran for re-election as the Democratic candidate in 1980. And Ronald Reagan won the Republican nomination, and he campaigned with an optimistic, can-do attitude that most Americans by 1980 found refreshing. In this sense, he was reminiscent, ironically, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I say ironically because Reagan is a Republican and Roosevelt was a Democrat. Indeed, Reagan, a conservative Republican, enjoyed telling people in the 1930s when he was a young man that he had been an FDR man. He said that he never left the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left him. What he meant by that was that over the years after the Second World War, the Democratic Party became too liberal for Ronald Reagan and, frankly, for a number of Americans. During the campaign, Reagan quipped, and Reagan had great speechwriters, and he was wonderful at delivering a line because, of course, Ronald Reagan was a former actor. Reagan quipped, "A recession is when your neighbor loses his job. A depression is when you lose your job. And a recovery is when Jimmy Carter loses his job." The people who were listening to that roared with approval and laughter. Reagan easily won the 1980 election. The economy was in such a shambles that Jimmy Carter, like Herbert Hoover in 1932, although the economy is not as bad as the Great Depression, but literally had little chance of winning that election. Reagan won with 51% of the vote, and while that doesn't sound impressive, 7% of the vote went to a third-party candidate in 1980. And whenever there's a serious third-party candidate, you know that the American people are unhappy with both parties, for that matter. Reagan brought to the White House a simple conservative philosophy. He said, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. This is exactly the opposite point of view from Democrats who see the federal government and its programs as the solution to problems. And this is the fundamental divide between Republicans and Democrats, both then and now. Republicans still like to look to the private sector, to individual Americans or non-governmental groups of Americans to solve our problems. Whereas Democrats almost always look to the government itself to create programs, raise taxes, and address our problems through the use of the federal government. Your basic question as a college student regarding politics is which of these philosophies best fits your temperament and to some extent your upbringing and also your own philosophical worldview. For Reagan, the federal government spent too much money on too many programs that interfered with the freedoms of the American people, especially interfered with American businessmen upon whom our prosperity depended. Every government program comes with a regulation or regulations. You have to do this, you have to do that. That's a limit on freedom. And every government program comes with a price tag. They cost money. And so Democrats are generally in favor of raising taxes to pay for their programs. Well, every time a person spends a dollar on taxes, that's a dollar that person does not have to do with as he or she wishes to do. And that is itself a limit on freedom. Again, you have to make up your mind as to what your priorities are. Reagan believed that many people, many Americans, took advantage of welfare programs when they might easily have been working. He hopes then to reduce the size of government programs, and put more people back to work. He would do that by restricting access to these programs, making getting into such a program or using such a program more difficult, and thus less costly. Reagan also believed that we, the United States, had declined as a superpower. But we didn't have to, he said. And so he began rebuilding America's defensive capabilities in both nuclear weapons, but also in conventional weapons, the tanks and the artillery and so forth of a modern army. Finally, in order to put more money in the hands of the people who earned it, Reagan dramatically cut taxes. And Republicans are almost always looking to cut taxes. Indeed, the Reagan tax cuts have been one of the key ingredients of American prosperity since 1982. Today, in 2020, we still have the Reagan tax structure largely in place. Taxes have been raised and cut, frankly, over the years, but the backbone of our present tax structure was put in place by Ronald Reagan. It is important to point out that Reagan's tax policies worked. Individual taxes went down, but the economy improved so much that federal tax revenues, the amount of money taken in by the federal government, actually went up, even though individual taxes were cut. And that's because the more people went to work, businesses made more money, and so more taxes went into the federal coffer. So Reagan cut taxes, but federal revenue went up. Now, Republicans like to point this out to Democrats to this day, but there are so many variables in this equation that worked for Ronald Reagan that it is not mathematically possible to absolutely predict that this would work starting from a lower tax base, which we would be doing if we attempted this kind of thing at the present day. The tax base that Reagan began to cut was a very high tax base. So again, I'm not saying it wouldn't work, I'm just saying the variables are significant. On the other hand, spending, especially on defense, far exceeded the government's ability to pay for it. Even welfare programs eventually continued to grow. So Reagan campaigned on the idea of cutting welfare programs. He also campaigned on the idea of spending more on defense, and he's going to do that, and dramatically so. But spending on welfare programs is actually going to grow under Ronald Reagan as well. In spite of the budget problems, the fact that we were running budget deficits on an annual basis, America was clearly on the right path under Ronald Reagan. By 1983, the economy was doing much better than it had done in the 1970s, and people were going back to work. Reagan's foreign policy. Ronald Reagan, of course, was president in the latter stages of the Cold War, and so his foreign policy has to deal with the Cold War. And Ronald Reagan, in my opinion, correctly believed that most of the trouble in the world came from the communist-led Soviet Union. He said, "The Soviets were prepared to commit any crime, to lie, to cheat, and do anything necessary to promote communism." Now keep in mind that the radical left in America, I'm talking about the communists and those who are sympathetic, who would prefer to call themselves socialists, not talking about the average Democrat, not talking about the majority of the Democratic Party at all. But keep in mind that the radical left in America believes that it's not the Soviet Union that is the focus of evil in the world, as Ronald Reagan would say. They believe that it was the United States and its capitalist policies and its aggressive foreign policy that was the primary cause of trouble in the world. So these people, these are Americans now, these people do not mind seeing American power, whether it's economic or military, decline, because they think that would mean a more stable, peaceful world. Ronald Reagan is diametrically opposed to that vision. And today, again, to make it relevant to the present day, this is exactly one of the divides of the radical left and an increasing number of Democrats and the more conservative, independent, and Republican Americans. Well, in 1983, Reagan proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI for short. SDI is an anti-nuclear missile defense system that would, when it became operational, be able to shoot down intercontinental ballistic missiles. That is, the missiles that are launched into the stratosphere, cover vast oceans and continents, and then land on their targets. These are ICBMs, a good acronym to know, Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. Well, SDI is designed to be able to shoot these missiles down in the stratosphere so they will do no harm. If SDI became operational, the United States would be the sole superpower, and the Soviet Union would not be able to threaten us in any way. Reagan's critics said that SDI was too expensive. This would be a scientific project along the lines of the Manhattan Project in the early years of the Second World War. The Manhattan Project, of course, was the U.S. government project to create a nuclear weapon. So again, Reagan's critics said it was too expensive and it would never work. They also said that the Soviets would be tempted to strike us before the system became operational. So the Soviets would be tempted to a preemptive strike. Well, if we wait until SDI is operational, we're the losers, so we have to hit now. There is some rationale behind that argument. It's a risk. Reagan was determined, however, to protect the American people, and the plan went forward. Reagan, indeed, was determined to end the Cold War if he could, end the Cold War on American terms. Reagan's decision now forces the Soviet Union to attempt to match the American program. Match it dollar for dollar. So now we have a battle of economies. Is the Soviet economy going to support this effort to match the Americans? Or will the Americans swamp the Soviets by their ability to bring the industrial base of the United States more fully into the conflict? So can the Soviets keep up? The election of 1984. In his first term, Ronald Reagan had clearly revitalized the United States. His new campaign slogan is, "America is back." And he asked the American people on the campaign trail, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" We are in the midst of a presidential campaign right now in 2020. And up until recently, when the coronavirus epidemic hit, the American economy was as good as it had ever been. And Donald Trump would certainly have campaigned on this kind of slogan, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" But the pandemic has dramatically changed this equation. And as I give this lecture here in early May of 2020, one has no idea what the focus of the campaign will be, other than Trump's character itself, which will clearly be part of the campaign, and what the American economy will be like in the fall of 2020. But back in 1984, the resounding answer to that question, and Ronald Reagan well knew it, otherwise he wouldn't have asked it, was yes, we are better off than we were 4 years ago. Walter Mondale, who had been Jimmy Carter's vice president, was the Democratic candidate, and Mondale had virtually no chance. Improving relations in the Cold War. While many people believe that Reagan wanted to annihilate the Soviet Union, this was not the case. What Reagan wanted was an end to the Cold War with an American victory. Or if not something that we declared victory over, at least America preeminent. For their part, the Soviets were in trouble. Their economy was in a shambles by the 1980s. They could not keep up with the Americans. Here was one of the great agricultural nations in the world. The Soviet resources in terms of agriculture actually dwarfed that of the United States, believe it or not. And yet the Russian economy, because of its communist principles, could not feed its own people. They had to import grain from the United States. This is one of the great facts of capitalism versus communism. But they could not keep up. They could not keep up with the United States in terms of defense spending and development of more modern and deadly, frankly, weapons. In 1985, the Soviets put their trust in a new generation, a new leader. The old men who had bankrupted the country, who had helped win the Second World War when they were young men, they were now replaced by a new generation. Mikhail Gorbachev, one of the most important men in the 20th century, was the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. And Gorbachev realized that he had to make some accommodation with the Americans. He had to come to some kind of understanding with the Americans, or his nation would fall apart economically and then, of course, politically. Now, Gorbachev was not a believer in democracy, but he did hope to reduce tensions with the United States so that the Soviets could then work on their economy. And he was willing to make accommodations in terms of that economy and culture within the Soviet Union. But he's not moving the Soviets towards democracy. In June 1985, again, in order to take the pressure off the Soviet economy, he proposed a meeting with Reagan in Geneva, Switzerland, to discuss the differences between the two countries. Amazingly, many people thought, Reagan accepted. And the people who were amazed by this, and this included a lot of the mainstream media and so forth, were amazed that Ronald Reagan, the ultimate Cold Warrior, accepted because they didn't understand Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan wanted to end the Cold War. And so he's willing to talk to Gorbachev. And by the way, Nancy Reagan encouraged her husband to listen. Yes, there were men in Reagan's cabinet and in his circle of advisors who said, be wary of a Soviet trick, but Nancy Reagan, to her great and everlasting credit, encouraged her husband to give Gorbachev a chance. Now, the Geneva Summit in 1985, summit meaning the meeting of these two great leaders, saw agreements on cultural exchanges, and it broke the ice for future such summits. But no agreement on arms control on ending the Cold War was made at this time in 1985. But the two leaders met again in 1987 when Gorbachev came to Washington, D.C. And this was after Gorbachev announced to the world that he was willing to make a deal on intermediate range nuclear missiles. Intermediate range nuclear missiles are not the ICBMs that cover oceans and continents. They are designed to go from one nation to another. So they might be placed in Western Europe and designed to hit Moscow, for example. Intermediate range nuclear missiles. Gorbachev now is willing to make a deal on such missiles. Before this, he was not willing to make a deal just on intermediate range. He always lumped the ICBMs into the package, and the Americans said no go on that. Well, this was the first time, 1987, in the Washington, D.C. summit, that the two nations had agreed to scuttle, that is, to get rid of, an entire weapons class. In 1989, Gorbachev also ended the Soviet war in Afghanistan. The world at this time properly cheered the man in the Kremlin. Afghanistan had literally become the Soviets' Vietnam. And in 1989, the Soviets, like the Americans did in Vietnam, got out of Afghanistan. As for Ronald Reagan, his conservative critics, and yes, Reagan has conservative critics, noted that he did not really curb the welfare state. He didn't reduce welfare spending as much as they would have liked. Now, Democrats accused him of reducing welfare spending, but what really happened was that instead of categorically reducing welfare spending, what Reagan did was reduce the rate of growth. So welfare spending continued to grow under Ronald Reagan. It just didn't grow as much as it would have had the Democrats been in control of the government during this time. And so conservative critics thought that Reagan should have scaled back welfare more than he did. And he didn't eliminate much of the federal government. He didn't reduce the power and cost of the federal government as much as his conservative critics wished he would. The federal budget was actually larger as a percentage of our gross domestic product than it had been under Carter. These conservative critics also wondered at the budget deficit. Reagan's defense buildup had been enormously expensive. Well, of course, Ronald Reagan had liberal critics. The entire Democratic Party was critical and actually had a lot of antipathy for the president. They argued that the welfare system had been slashed, but this was merely political rhetoric, as I've already explained. And liberal critics did not appreciate Reagan's emphasis on defense spending. This is one of the fundamental divides between the Republicans and Democrats. Democrats would prefer to spend money on social programs, and Republicans, when they're in office, they almost always add to the defense budget. But what was Ronald Reagan? Most Americans correctly saw him as an inspirational leader. Even his enemies admit that he was inspirational. And he was an inspirational leader like Franklin Roosevelt in a time of doubt and difficulty. He was unflinchingly committed to a philosophy of free enterprise, limited government, and strenuous anti-communism. Reagan's greatest successes lay in, number one, renewing the hope and faith of Americans in themselves and in their country. And again, I compare him to Franklin Delano Roosevelt in this. And for those of you who don't remember Roosevelt well, he led the Americans in the midst of the Great Depression and also throughout the great length, right up to the very end of the war in Europe as well. Number two, he stimulated a very strong period of economic growth and prosperity. Throughout the 80s and into the 90s, the Reagan economy brought Americans to just fantastic levels of prosperity and an increase in the standard of living. Number three, was Reagan's policies and his diplomacy that pressured the Soviet Union into reaching accommodations that would eventually lead to the end of the Cold War. Now, the end of the Cold War does not come while Reagan was president, but Reagan's successor, his hand-picked successor, Republican, George H.W. Bush, who was Reagan's vice president, will accomplish the end of the Cold War on American terms. And what was Reagan's primary failure? Well, it's the debt. The increase of the budget deficit. But the mitigating factor in this was that it may well be possible that ending the Cold War and bringing the United States out of its economic woes were not possible other than spending the kind of money that Ronald Reagan spent. In my opinion, Ronald Reagan was a near great president. And just in case you're thinking, well, that's entirely partisan, Irish is a conservative. Not as much as my conservative critics would like me to be. And I would argue that the greatest president of the 20th century was easily Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat. So I'm trying to be objective here in my analysis and not be swayed by politics. In the final analysis, Ronald Reagan did exactly what Franklin Roosevelt had done. Both men renewed the faith of the American people in difficult times, in times of doubt and confusion. Ironically, FDR had done this by using the federal government in new ways. Reagan did it by restraining the federal government in some ways. What both men had in common was deficit spending and leaving a larger debt than when they became president of the United States. George Bush and the end of the Cold War. As I just mentioned, Reagan's vice president was George H.W. Bush. He is the father of the George Bush that was president during the childhood and young adult years of many of you, or I should say some of you. And so George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, becomes president in 1989. And he inherited a world in which democracy was on the rise. Communism, dictatorship, on the run, in decline. This was in large part due to Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. And so I give credit to both men, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. One would not have been successful in ending the Cold War without the other. It's a team effort. Gorbachev had made it quite obvious that unlike his predecessors, he would not use force to maintain the Soviet system. This meant that the Soviet Empire would soon fall. And so I'm also going to credit George H.W. Bush in the ending of the Cold War, but still more credit to Ronald Reagan for setting the stage. So Gorbachev, Reagan, Bush. The most spectacular event in the collapse of the Soviet Empire came in Germany in November 1989. So there's your date. When German citizens using small tools in their bare hands tore down the great symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall stood in the middle of the city of Berlin and divided communist East Berlin from non-communist West Berlin. And when that wall came down, that was the symbolic end of the Cold War. Soon, East Germany, communist East Germany, ceased to exist and was reunified under the government, the free and democratic government of West Germany. A unified Germany now joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact, the counterpart of NATO, fell apart. So again, the Cold War was officially over in 1989 because Mikhail Gorbachev refused to use force to maintain the Soviet Empire, as the Soviet leaders had done so many times during the long history of the Cold War. The world was stunned at these events. but more were coming. I remember watching the scenes of the Berlin Wall being torn down and realizing that the Cold War was coming to an end. And at this time, I was in my mid-30s and still in my PhD program at the University of Washington. And I sat watching these events on television. And I imagine if you could see a picture of me at that time, my jaw would be dropped. I had imagined up until these moments that I would live my entire life in the Cold War. And so I was one of those who was stunned at these developments. Credit to Ronald Reagan, who grew up in a different time in America when there was no Cold War. And he could see over this period of time, past this period of time, to an ending of the Cold War. Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, when nations like Poland went free, the Soviet republics, who were actually part of the Soviet system, that is, the Soviet Union itself, think of the states of the United States. The Soviet republics now saw their chance to follow Eastern European nations and declare their independence from Mother Russia. Not only had the Soviet Cold War empire collapsed in 1989, so had the entire Soviet Union in 1991. So there is no longer a Soviet Union. We simply have Russia. Now, it's true that Vladimir Putin, the leader of Russia at this time, saw the collapse of the old Soviet Union, and indeed of the Soviet Empire, as one of the great evils in modern history. And so he is trying to recreate the Soviet Union. If not as a communist state, certainly as an empire. Well, many observers now in 1991 imagine that the end of the Cold War and the end of the Soviet Union meant the end of the world's problems. That the end of the Cold War would not destabilize the world, but we would enter into a period of peace and prosperity and harmony. But most of these people have at the basic level a view of human nature that is not historically accurate. They believe that human beings are essentially good, and that if you remove evil institutions that bar human beings from realizing their full good potential, then you will have succeeded in creating some kind of a mankind-based millennium. But this is not what history teaches us about human nature. It's not what the Bible teaches us about human nature. Human beings are flawed. Human beings are sinful. And it's not just the great institutions such as communism or capitalism that are the problems in the world. The problem in the world really comes right down to the sin nature, the selfish nature of human beings. Imagine a Western town in which the sheriff and a quick-triggered outlaw vied with one another for control of the town. Finally, rather than the final shootout, the outlaw died of a heart attack. Perhaps the sheriff now would lose interest in what was going on in the town. And in that situation, with the outlaw dead and the sheriff disinterested, other lesser outlaws, bad guys, would be emboldened to do what evil they would. There would be no one to stop them. In the same way, after the end of the Cold War, smaller nations led by dictators who were once intimidated by the two superpowers, they became convinced that they might act without consequences. Human nature. Such was the case in the Middle East when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990. Summary. The end of the Cold War was the end of a major epoch in world history. The Soviet Union and communism had lost to the forces of the United States and democracy. And Americans could be justly proud of their victory. But the United States also had serious problems by this time. The Cold War had cost trillions of dollars, dollars that had been borrowed from the future, and so the nation was deep in debt. Moreover, with the end of the Cold War, people wondered, people on both sides of the, people all over the world, wondered what role the United States would play in the world now. President Bush, President H.W. Bush, was about to give a resounding answer to that question in response to Saddam Hussein and Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. And that response was something that many Americans did not appreciate at this time. Well, God bless you all. And thank you very much for your kind attention.